So, a writer recently asked me, how can you create an extremely original villain? And after reflecting on my own experience of publishing 4 fantasy books and now having coached over 90 writers through my different programs, I've realized that there are 5 key principles that will help you write a villain that feels fresh, unpredictable, dangerous, and incredibly memorable. And the first principle is to start with an original motivation. One of the best ways to make your antagonist feel fresh is by giving them motivations that we don't see all the time. So many antagonists are after power, money, or revenge. Sure, those motivations can work well, but if you want readers to walk away feeling like they've encountered someone truly unique, then your villain needs a reason that goes beyond the usual cliches. Here's a few less commonly seen examples to give you a bit of inspiration here. Number 1, redemption. Maybe your villain is trying to redeem themselves for a past mistake, even if it means they make some morally questionable decisions. For example, maybe you have a powerful sorcerer who once unleashed a devastating curse on a village and is now seeking a kind of redemption by trying to eliminate all magic because they think it's too dangerous for mortals to have. This relentless crusade then will put them at odds with your main character if your main character is trying to use their magic in a responsible fashion. Number 2, the greater good. Perhaps your villain or your antagonist is driven by a genuine belief that their actions will improve society or the world, and this means your villain could be a kind of reformer or idealist almost who has just gone a little bit too far. For example, maybe you write about a revolutionary leader who genuinely wants to free their people from a tyrannical regime, but they believe the only way to succeed is through extreme sacrifice. As a result, maybe they see casualties, even amongst innocent bystanders, as an acceptable price to pay for the greater freedom they envision. Number 3, legacy. Maybe your villain is motivated by a desire to leave a lasting legacy or achieve some form of immortality or long-lasting reputation. They could be driven to be making their mark on history or to be gaining eternal life, even if it requires morally dark choices to do so. Again, this is a bit of an instance of the end justifying the means. For example, maybe you write about an ancient monarch who is trying to build a dynasty that will rule for eternity. And this monarch is very willing to sacrifice their own family members, citizens, and anyone else who gets in their way, if it means that they can create this unbreakable line that will endure for generations. Number 4, desire for love, family, or belonging. Sometimes your villain just wants connection, but they have a twisted approach to finding it. As a result, they may force loyalty, try to control relationships, or manipulate people to create the sense of belonging that they crave. For example, maybe you have a lonely forest witch who kidnaps passing travelers and attempts to build a psychically brainwashed community deep in the woods. She essentially is charming or cursing these people to stay, believing that as long as no one leaves, she finally has her family. Number 5, restoring the natural order. Maybe your villain sees themselves as a guardian of nature or some cosmic balance, or they seek to protect some kind of special tradition. As a result, they may oppose the change that your protagonist is trying to create because they see that protagonist as upsetting the natural order of things. For example, a spirit of death who views the healing magic used by your main character as an affront to the natural order of life and death may see themselves as restoring balance when they are preventing mortals from unnaturally extending their lives, and therefore they would be in pretty obvious opposition to your main character. And then the last example of an original antagonist motivation here is curiosity. For example, maybe you have a magic user who is obsessed with discovering new spells, and as a result, they're constantly testing forbidden magic on themselves and on others. Even as the side effects from that become horrifying, they may be driven by this belief that this knowledge is worth any price, and any sacrifice is justified if I can be making progress in my understanding of the magic. When you give your villain a motivation we haven't seen before, you start to build a character who feels so much more complex and memorable as a result. But if you want to take this to the next level, then you should also be following the second principle. Make their approach distinctive. It's not just what the antagonist wants, but how they actually try to get it. So maybe, for example, your main character is a warrior who everyone usually attacks with physical force. But maybe your main antagonist gains access to the journal of your main character's old mentor. They then use their knowledge of the main character's past to exploit them, make them doubt their memories, make them doubt their abilities, maybe even make them question their motivations, until your main character is paralyzed by self-doubt. The key point here is that when you give your antagonist this unique approach to attacking your main character, it sets them apart and it makes them feel fresh. Plus, it also really increases the amount of challenge and conflict that your main character goes through. To give you a bit of inspiration here, here's 3 somewhat unique ways that your antagonist can be attacking your main character. The first one is by undermining your protagonist's morals and principles. So maybe your antagonist is really good at setting up situations where the hero must compromise their values, hoping to break their spirit or push them into moral ambiguity. The second method is to use psychological manipulation. So maybe the villain distorts your main character's perception of reality or plants seeds of doubt in their mind, gradually undermining their confidence and mental stability. Number 3, corrupting influence. Maybe your villain is able to slowly corrupt and turn your protagonist's friends and allies against them, so their support network is weakened as they go through the story, leaving your character all alone to face your antagonist. Okay, so we're about to move on to the third principle for crafting unique antagonists, and I would say out of everything in this video, this is my personal favorite. But first, if you're wanting to write better characters in your fantasy novel, you should definitely join my free 5-day character writing course. You can sign up to that by using the link in the description. This course shares the best character development exercises I've learned from writing my own novels, and almost 2,000 fantasy writers have gone through it so far. Many of them have even left amazing reviews, like this one from Daniel Wilford. Before I took this 5-day crash course, my characters were flat, dull, and hardly had one dimension. But afterward, I improved in ways I didn't even realize were possible. It's hard to choose just one piece of advice as the most useful, but if I had to pick, I'd go with the character hooks and interviews because they help me give my characters personalities and understand them on a deeper level. Thanks, Jed. You can sign up for free by using the link in the description below this video. And now let's move on to the third principle for writing highly original antagonists. Show what your antagonist is like outside of the main story conflict. What is your antagonist doing when they're not clashing with your main character? This is a question I love to ask the students in my fantasy outlining bootcamp. We're actually currently in the middle of character week in cohort 4 of the program at the moment, so we're having a lot of fun discussions about my students' characters, and I'm really enjoying it. Now, back to this kind of question. You don't always need a good answer for this because some villains do work better when they are mysterious and unknowable. However, in a lot of fantasy novels, it can be really powerful to show your antagonist's regular life. This is the kind of detail that makes them feel far more human and far more layered. For example, in the 1992 anti-Western Unforgiven, little Bill Daggett, who is the town's corrupt sheriff, is shown spending time just happily working on his house. He's a terrible carpenter, but he's proud of his work and he shows it off despite its flaws. This small glimpse into his personal life makes him feel so much more human and less like this one-dimensional villain, and as a result, there is just a much greater sense of layers and complexity to his character. Because without this scene, he might just come across as a standard, somewhat cliched, corrupt authority figure, but this personal detail of him being this really amateurish and really crappy carpenter makes him so much more memorable and relatable, and then also contrasts to later in the story where he is just genuinely terrifying and extremely intimidating. Plus, it also leads to this fantastic final dialogue exchange with William Money, our anti-hero protagonist.
I don't deserve this. To die like this. I was building a house. Deserves got nothing to do with it.
Now, the next principle to be thinking about is to rethink the term villain. Personally, I hate the word villain. I find it to be incredibly limiting. And the reason for that is because it just implies someone who is quite one-dimensionally evil or morally bankrupt with no possibility of redemption and a certain lack of realism to them. Instead of thinking hero versus villain, I like to think in terms of protagonist, which is just the person we're following in the story, and antagonist, who is the person opposing that point of view character. And I know I've been using the terms antagonist and villain somewhat interchangeably in this video, but my key point here is that an antagonist is just simply the person who opposes your main character's goals. They just stand in your hero's way. Sure, they could be an evil Dark Lord, but it could also be your character's parents who just want them to take a different route with their life. Or maybe it's your protagonist's love interest who doesn't want your character getting involved in the plot of your story. You get the picture here, right? Like, this framing just lets you create a character who is not necessarily evil, but who just opposes the protagonist for their own reasons. And this opens up a lot of space for originality. because now you don't have to check off the usual mustache-twirling villain boxes, right? You can have an antagonist be morally ambiguous or even sympathetic, maybe more sympathetic than your main character. And that makes them so much more interesting and thought-provoking to read. To quote from James Baldwin, "No one is more dangerous than he who imagines himself pure in heart, for his purity by definition is unassailable." For example, in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, Inspector Javert is not a sort of mustache-twirling evil villain. I've used that term mustache-twirling quite a bit in this video, but I think it kind of captures what I'm talking about here. Javert is just relentlessly loyal to the law. So his role as antagonist to our protagonist, Jean Valjean, is not based on personal hatred, it's driven by a strict sense of justice. Javert's motivations are understandable, even if they are extreme in how he's pursuing our main character, and he is someone that you can actually sympathize with because he's just trying to do his job, even though he is opposed to your main character. So when you reframe villain as antagonist, it just allows you as a writer to explore these shades of grey that make your characters feel so much more realistic. And this is why I love stories like A Game of Thrones or the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie, because it's not good guy and bad guy. It's just everyone is trying to get the things that they want, and that puts them into opposition with each other. And I think that that is more realistic to how life actually works. And then the next principle to think about when it comes to writing more original, unique antagonists in your fantasy novel is to apply the 99% rule. So in my first chapter mastery course, I talk about this idea of using the 99% rule in your opening chapter. Essentially, the rule goes like this. How can you show your main character making a choice that 99% of other characters would not make in the same situation? And how can you do that in the early chapters of your novel to quickly give a reader a snapshot of who this person is and what's important to them? When you can do this, when you can have your main character making an unusual or unique decision, it shows readers that this character is different from other characters they've read. It shows they're different from the norm, and that helps to make them so much more memorable, because what you're doing here is giving them a unique edge that keeps them from feeling generic. And this same advice applies equally well to your antagonists. For example, consider Hans Lander in Inglourious Basterds. Hans Lander is a Nazi officer, but he doesn't act like a stereotypical cold-hearted villain. Instead, he's kind of charming, polite, and he sort of plays with his prey in these oddly courteous ways before exposing them. For example, in the opening scene, he is sitting down with this French farmer and he spends almost 10 minutes in pleasant small talk before he gets the farmer to then reveal that he's hiding Jews under the floorboards. Most antagonists in that role would go in guns blazing, relying on physical force to apprehend their targets. Yet Hans Lander's manipulation and patience makes him so much more unsettling and unique. He operates in a way that 99% of other antagonists probably wouldn't. And that makes him far more memorable. Now, if you want to make sure that your fantasy antagonists are as interesting as possible, it is crucial to avoid the 7 most common antagonist mistakes that I often see new fantasy writers make. You can click here to watch this video where I break down these 7 mistakes along with how to avoid each of them. Keep writing and keep striving.